Good afternoon, everyone. We are about to kick off our last panel. We have plenty of room up front if folks want to move up and be a little closer to the action. There are a couple tables here, so feel free to make that jump if you'd like. I also wanted to just remind you that if you are thinking about tweeting about this conference, the hashtag for Twitter is every 3 seconds, with 3 being the number 3, and it's on your tent cards. So we have a really great closing panel here today. Thank you to all of you who have sort of stuck it out through the end here. We are, I think we got done with a great opening with our great keynote session. This final panel of the day has 3 folks who we have invited to talk about the future of consumer protection. I think the first panel of the day really focused on where we've been on identity theft. This last keynote session was sort of talking about where we are today, and this final session is where are we going? And we have a really great panel lined up. First up, we have Betsy Broder, and she is with the Federal Trade Commission. And I'm losing my notes here, so apologies while I find that. Okay. So we have Eva Velasquez from the Identity Theft Resource Center, as well as Ann Wallace from the Identity Theft Assistance Identity Theft Assistance Corporation. So we are going to go right into, if we could hand it off to each of you to spend 1 or 2 minutes talking about how you come to this issue of identity theft. Betsy?
Thanks, John, and thank you so much for including me in this. I brought my copy of the strategic plan from the Identity Theft Task Force. I was going to ask Debbie Majoris to autograph it. So back when this was promulgated, I was the staff. I was working in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection and was a staff lead on assembling and working with the task force. So it's really, I have to say, one of my colleagues at the time, a sort of cynical person, said, you know, these task forces, you kind of do the work, you publish a book, and you put it on the shelf. This has been a phenomenal and a successful, I think, work plan for this effort, and so I'm really proud to do this. In my current capacity, I am Counsel for International Consumer Protection at the Federal Trade Commission's Office of International Affairs, and in that context, I work in many multilateral organizations that work on issues of cyber fraud, cyber crime, including identity theft. And so the perspective that I bring both is as someone who worked on the report and was involved in the identity theft program from its inception, and now more recently through the international realm.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll call this the Ride or Die crew. Thank you all for staying. I know we're the only thing in between you guys getting back to your offices and your email. My name is Eva Velasquez. I'm the president and CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center. When you heard Chairman Ramirez talking about the partnership that she has with the ITRC, that's my organization. We have a secondary call center that helps victims of identity theft mitigate their cases, and they can often get very, very complex. So it's not a quick 5-minute phone call. My advisors are often on the phone 45 minutes to an hour helping victims walk through that process. I became very interested in this issue. I've always been a consumer protection advocate. I spent 21 years at the San Diego District Attorney's Office investigating economic crimes. For the last 11 years, it was primarily unfair business practices and false advertising. And after that, I decided to go over to the Better Business Bureau, and I ran their operations department. So all of the consumer-facing education and awareness materials. I've been with the ITRC for about a year now, and this is an issue that is growing astronomically. I do think that we've made progress, that I appreciate all of those efforts that have been made, but when you look at the statistics that were just released today, it's several million more people have been affected by this issue just year over year.
Well, and I'm Ann Wallace. I'm head of the Identity Theft Assistance Center. Most of you know us as ITech, And ITech was created in 2004 by a group of financial services companies, our members, who realized that even though individually they were helping their customers recover from identity theft, they believed there was a lot more that the industry could do on a collaborative basis. So ours is a unique model, the first ever private sector collaboration where a group of companies got together and said, we can do a better job, we can do even more to help our customers recover from this crime by working together and by sharing information. So it's been a very exciting project. We've helped close to 150,000 individual consumers. I was talking to Eva a moment ago about putting a real face on the numbers. And I know she's got some terrific stories that she's going to share with you as we go along. But we are there helping customers work through those problems and both recover from the crime. And also the second part of our mission is communications and education. So we partner all the time with FTC and with others on, how can we keep getting these messages out to consumers, helping them identify the new risks and be prepared and protect themselves. And then the third part of our mission is partnering with law enforcement, is sharing information with the FTC's Consumer Sentinel database, which, as most of you know, is accessible by law enforcement agencies all over the country. So the hope is that they can make connections among individual cases and do a better job in catching the bad guys and putting them in jail.
Great. Well, let's start with a general question. Over the past 15 years, Congress, the executive branch, state and local governments, and the private sector have gone to great lengths to address the problem of identity theft. And as you mentioned, and as the Bureau of Justice Statistics today state, ID theft remains a problem of massive proportions. What are we doing right on this, and what could we be doing better or differently? Throwing out to the panel.
I'll go ahead. I think that we have made progress, tremendous progress in the law enforcement area. The ITRC has been around since 1999, and when it was first started, the primary complaint from consumers was that they could not get police to actually acknowledge that a crime had been committed. They couldn't get a police report, which, as you know, is that critical piece that where all the protections kick in. They need to have that. And while we still get complaints about that, they're not nearly as often. Probably a couple of times a month rather than consistently every day. So we've certainly done that part right. I think where we're getting it wrong and where we need to be looking to the future, we segregate a lot of these issues, privacy, cybersecurity, scams and fraud, and they are their own issues in their own right, but they all culminate eventually into a higher risk of identity theft. If any of these are improperly handled or you are the victim of one type of scam, oftentimes it's that 1-2 punch. So you get the immediate issue where you've been victimized, and then months later you find that your identity's been compromised. And we need to take a little bit more of a holistic approach and really look at this from from the 50,000-foot viewpoint and say, okay, all of these things are affected, but ultimately this is all about identity fraud, and that particular issue.
What are we doing well? Well, I'm tremendously proud of the work that's come out of my agency in understanding that, since the FTC became involved in this issue, which was when Congress passed the Identity Theft Act in 1998, we've gone almost from a binary world to a digital world. The complexity of the issues have just become, dazzling. So I think our team has done an exceptional job of staying ahead of the trends, if you will. So what's the data showing? Medical identity theft, tax-related identity theft, employment-related identity theft, and this is where we've had workshops and done studies and worked with all of the stakeholders. And I think that they've, and the staff is here, the team is here, they've done a phenomenal job of identifying the key issues. When we started this, it was, very simple. It was, can I tell a story?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the first big identity theft panic, if you will, and this was well before we created this division of privacy and identity protection, is we heard from an employer in the Baltimore area that a group of their employees discovered that they all were having problems with their credit report. And they didn't know this until they were hanging around the water cooler and someone said, the strangest thing happened. I applied for a loan and I couldn't get it. And then I ended up seeing my credit report and someone opened up all of these accounts in my name. It turned out that there was a temporary employee working in that office. And one day he left. And he took with him the paper files, employment files, for all of the people who worked in that office. And then he spread this up and down the East Coast, and people opened up accounts in these names. And so it was like, it was so, paper. He stole paper, and he opened up accounts. You know, I guess that still happens to a certain extent, but people have implemented much better security with respect to paper documents, and people also look for a larger bucket of data. You know, let's not go to a boutique, let's go to the Costco, if you will, of information. And so the threats have become much more complex. The way to deal with cross-border issues and jurisdictional issues, if there is data that was taken from, let's call it the cloud, and you want to execute a search warrant, you know, where's the jurisdiction? What courts can do that? It just becomes a much more complicated, global, and technologically challenging world, and I think it's a constant game of catch-up, although I must say I was tremendously impressed when the first panel and the AUSA talking about the cases and the impact of the cases, and that's really great. That needs to be the norm and not the exceptional case.
I would just second what Betsy said about what are we doing right. We've done a pretty darn good job educating consumers. I mean, 8 years ago or whenever, you know, people really didn't know about protecting their personal information. We've created, I think, a pretty darn good baseline of information, of awareness about, I need to protect this information, and they have the basic tools. But again, as Betsy said, the world has just gotten so much more complex. We always thought of, in the beginning, we thought of identity fraud as, you know, somebody creating a fraudulent account in my name. But Willie Sutton was wrong. Banks are not just where the money is. What we're seeing today is value is everywhere. And what the criminals are doing are exploiting all of the repositories of value, whether it's, you know, medical services, whether it's insurance services, disability payments, the use of somebody's identity to get a false driver's license, a false passport, to avoid crime. I mean, so there are just so many opportunities to extract value using people's personal information that, you know, the world has just gotten so much more complicated. And consumers may say, well, I know how to check the security of my bank accounts. And of course, in financial services, they're very good recovery methods. You know, we have laws that allow you to correct mistakes on credit cards and bank accounts and so forth. But correcting something like an arrest record, you know, that was created with your information, or, you know, a fake passport or Social Security benefits, or so many of these other forms of identity theft, is just, you know, we haven't really evolved to the place where there's a way for consumers to, you know, a recognized path to recover from those kinds of types of identity theft.
Well, you know, that I think.
If I could just piggyback on that, I agree with you, especially with the criminal identity theft. There isn't a process in place. The consumers that are harmed by that are truly harmed. Generally speaking, they can't hire an attorney, especially if it's a felony. They can't hire an attorney even if they had the money. The people that we help, 70% of them are low to moderate income, so they generally don't have the funds to hire legal representation. But even if they could, they can't hire them to appear on their behalf. They have to go in person to whatever court, whatever jurisdiction it was in, and go prove that that is not them, and go through that process. And it's time consuming, and they miss work, and they have to pay for the travel and pay for all of those things. And generally speaking, from that, they are not made whole. They don't get reimbursed from anybody for those costs. They are a victim of a crime. Sometimes they can apply for victim assistance through that jurisdiction, but it's not, while we've made a lot of progress in the other areas, that one, as well as medical identity theft, is also one where we don't have a very solid set process on how you remediate that. We're getting there, we're making progress, but it certainly isn't as robust as the progress we use for financial identity theft. And just lastly, I think we also need to start redefining the way we think of identity. Everything that we're talking about here is all about your PII. We talk about your social. We talk about all of those tokens that identify you. But as we keep moving forward with all the technology, some of it's really scary how the hackers are using it. We need to think about our biometrics as part of our identity and something that we need to consider protecting. We need to think about our behavior. All of that data, all those data points about how we behave, yes, we're using it in our fraud analytics, but that just means that the crooks are figuring out a way to capitalize on that as well. So I really think we need to think about how we define identity also.
Mm-hmm. You know, in our first panel today, one of the themes that came out is that identity theft is a symptom of data insecurity. And you know, one of the, obviously there's been an explosion. I think we've heard the statistics of 1 billion records compromised. There's been an explosion in data breach, I think, to the extent it's safe to say that today it's the primary way consumers' information is being put at risk. You know, we mentioned earlier how in the past it might have been dumpster diving crooks that got that information, but today hackers can get millions of records at the push of a button. Should consumers just resign themselves to the fact that their data will always be insecure, or are there additional steps that government and the private sector can and should take to better protect consumers' data?
Well, go ahead.
I would never say that you resign yourself, but at the same time, I think that, you know, if you talk to any security expert, you know, they'll always say there is no absolute guarantee, but of security. But because there is no absolute guarantee, does not mean that we should tell consumers to be resigned to it. I think there's that balance between what you can expect the individual to do and then how to allocate responsibility across the board. So so there's an appropriate allocation of responsibility, you know, to the other parties in the chain. One of the things we talk about in financial services is the weakest link. You know, the financial services industry is very focused on obviously on data integrity and security. The concern now is in the industry that, you know, there are smaller institutions that may not have the same kind of levels of security that, you know, maybe they should have. And that means that they can access the financial services system and sort of go up the chain. And I think if you expand that to other sectors, you have this problem of the weaker links really creating increased risk for all the other participants.
Having said that, and referring back to the reference to small businesses that may not have the Chinese restaurant that has the compromised swipe point of sale, the FTC has, not only do we do consumer education, we do business education, and we put a lot of thought. Procter & Gamble doesn't need to go to the FTC website to figure out how to build a data security program, but smaller businesses do. So we have a library of materials for small businesses that are very basic on, you know, from how you lock up your documents and who you hire and what you vet and kind of a scaled approach to data security, which I think is important. And I think it's, you know, certainly we have a very aggressive enforcement program on data security, and it brought a number of cases where there have been a failure to adopt reasonable procedures to secure data. That having been said, I think we need to look at the flip side, which is once the data is compromised, you know, why can it be used? Why can someone use my date of birth and social security number and name to get a credit card without any other kind of out-of-pocket way of verifying or authenticating the applicant? So we talked, you know, both sessions talked about the challenges of authentication, and I think when we look structurally at the lifeline of an identity theft episode. It's at that last point where you get the information and you use it to your economic advantage. And how can we tighten up the system there to make it less, to make the information less value? It's not that people want social security numbers because they like the strings of numbers. It's because with that information they can get value. So we need to figure out how to turn off the access there between the number and the product which they're getting of some economic value. So, we should never be resting on our laurels. FTC keeps bringing data security cases because companies keep, neglecting to employ the most reasonable, off-the-shelf, commonly available security measures for their systems, or fail to vet properly the people who are dealing with highly sensitive data. So, I think, like everything else, it needs to be a holistic approach.
Betsy, early on the first panel of the day, I was struck, I think it was Zach Intruder from the U.S. Attorney's Office, who talked about how in Russia, the cyber thieves are told, don't leave the country, or don't go to a country where you might get extradited from. And it seems to me that that's extremely troubling, that there would be such an acknowledgement that this problem exists, that you would tell people don't go there because you might get arrested for what we know you're doing anyway. So, and I think that points to the larger issue that identity theft is really a global problem, and that identity thieves are often located far beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. So the FTC recently agreed to an MOU with 2 Nigerian law enforcement agencies to increase cooperation on identity theft and other issues. What are the challenges that the FTC faces, and I'll throw it to, and other financial services industries as well? What are the challenges that you face in achieving more of these types of agreements?
Well, we're really pleased with this agreement, the MOU with the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission of Nigeria, which is a criminal enforcement agency, and the Consumer Protection Council, which is a civil organization on consumer protection. And the goal of this is not directed specifically at identity theft, but to find common challenges. Nigerians have consumer protection problems. It's not just a bunch of what they call the Yahoo boys, with prince uncles who are wanting to give you their money. It's a very complex situation. So we have a much closer relationship with the Nigerians, and hopefully we can use that to the advantage of both countries. But in looking at the problem of identity theft and the global reach, there are not all the people that we think have the keys to the solution feel like playing with us and signing MOUs. So I guess one of the biggest challenges is they don't care. That is, it's like the Russians that was given the example of, there are safe havens out there for identity thieves, and they're bringing tremendous amount of resources into their country. And one of the recommendations of the Identity Theft Task Force was to identify those safe havens and do something about it. And I really can't speak to what the measures have been taken, but on other countries where there is an awareness of the problem, sometimes they lack the technical capacity to bring enforcement actions, even though they have the will to do so. And so the Department of Justice, along with the Department of State and others, have been doing technical assistance missions to countries that have particular vulnerabilities, so that the local law enforcement can be trained, the technologists and investigators can be trained on how to identify these risks and prosecute them. And this would be good. We need more cops on the beat, especially in those countries with compromised networks, if you will. So, safe havens, lack of will, lack of capacity, lack of resources, the list goes on. The good news is that there are lots of venues for countries, both with resources and without, to work collaboratively. And so one of them is under the rubric of the Budapest Convention, which is a cybercrime document of which about 50 countries are members of, including the United States, and which sets kind of a common basis for cybercrime legislation and information sharing, but we just need to expand that tremendously.
Okay, great. And is there a role for international cooperation in the financial services industry?
Well, I think there is in all industries. I mean, as Betsy was talking about, countries that are safe havens. I was thinking about the outsourcing and global expansion. I mean, after all, we live in a global economy, and many companies now look to, they obviously look at protection that the countries that they're considering, where do I put my factory, where do I put my sales distribution center, whatever, they're looking at that country's protection of intellectual property, and they look at things like security and the infrastructure to protect their people and to protect their locations. And I believe that they also look at things like security and protection of their information, and they probably should be looking even more closely at those kinds of considerations, because let's face it, when we talk about what has value, it's information. And so that is obviously the most fundamental thing that any company has is its information. And so as part of the expansion of their global operations, the ability to protect their information has got to be a part of that.
Right. And I think that when we're talking about protecting financial information for companies, and really it's about protecting not only the data that they have for their own operations, but it's the data they get from consumers individually. I mean, there's always much more, it seems like there's much more collection going on of data on consumers. But I wanted to sort of go back to Eva. Eva, at the, one of the things that we hear about at fraud.org, which is the website I run, that's a plug, is from consumers who have the same frustrations that I think you hear at ITRC, is about law enforcement not listening to them, not understanding what the problem is when they're faced with a variety of types of fraud, including identity theft. You talked about that, and you also talked about sort of the frustration and inability of consumers to get reimbursed for the time and money they spend trying to make themselves whole, and even sometimes they're not successful at doing that. Are there other frustrations that you are hearing from consumers, as someone who is on the ground hearing these calls every day from consumers, that folks who work on this issue at a higher level need to be thinking about as we come up with policies to address the evolution of identity theft?
Well, the issues, of course, the lack of support from law enforcement, which, as I said, in my experience has actually gotten a lot better. That is one of them. One of the other ones that we hear a lot is that most of the consumers that we work with, they really don't have a broad understanding of the financial system on the whole, so they don't understand how they have become a victim of identity theft. Parents calling in because they are starting to get collection notices for bills for their 9-year-old child are not understanding how that happened, and that is part of their frustration. They go, how is it that someone simply got that information, made up a birthday and a name, these synthetic identities now, and now has run up $50,000 in credit card bills? How is that even possible? And so that's a big part of their frustration, that there aren't enough, I think you talked about authenticators and enough secondary authenticators for these types of things, and that system as it is right now really does need to be addressed as far as child identity theft is concerned. Medical identity theft is also another source of frustration, because people are starting to realize we're doing a lot of awareness in this. The survey that we did just at the beginning of this year and one that we're doing at the end of the year, we're seeing increasing numbers of people actually understanding what it is. Most people didn't even know what is that? How does that even work? How does that affect me? And the frustration of those people is that they now have medical records that are mixed with this stranger's medical records, and they don't know how to resolve that. They will sometimes have HIPAA quoted to them if they say that they're a victim of identity theft and request their medical records. Now the hospitals and care providers feel compelled to protect the information based on that law, feel compelled to protect the information of the thief. They don't want to have any HIPAA violations. So the mechanisms that we have in place to help protect people in this instant are harming them and making it more difficult. And it really is, when you look at this, it's a financial crime, yes, but this particular type of medical or a particular type of identity theft does have violent crime consequences. People can die. They can lose their health. They can be misdiagnosed. They can be mistreated if they've got the wrong blood type in those medical records and they don't know it. These are a big deal. And we get calls from people, prescription, identity theft to get prescription narcotics and painkillers. We'll have people call up trying to get their legitimate prescriptions filled, but someone has stolen their identity, used it to get these narcotics, and now there's a contraindication on it, so they can't get their legitimate prescription. And they often go days or weeks without something that they need to manage their health. It's really a big focus of ours and really a big frustration of the victims.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, your mention of child ID theft, I think, made me think that, you're really not safe from identity theft from almost the time you're born.
Unsafe at any age.
I know, and actually...
And after you die, too.
Yeah, I know. I was about to say this. A few years ago, I testified on the death master file being used to commit identity theft. This is the database that Social Security Administration uses that's public and has Social Security numbers of millions of folks who have passed away, and identity thieves are using that. So the point is that you're not safe from identity theft when you're born. You're not even safe from it when you're dead. So we've talked a lot about what the FTC is doing in protecting consumers. I'd like to sort of delve a little bit into the role that the private sector should play in ensuring that customer data is secured from breach and ultimately from identity thieves. Is breach notification enough, or does the government have to play a role in nudging businesses to improve their data security procedures? Are there incentives that we should be thinking about for private business to make this happen? Are there particular technologies? We talked about two-factor authentication a couple times and the challenge of authentication. Are there particular technologies that businesses should be looking for to implement to better protect their customers' data from identity theft? I'll throw this out to the panel.
Well, there's a lot of questions, but let me start with, is breach notification enough? No, because that's after the fact. So yes, we're on record in favor of a national, federal law relating to breach notification, because right now we have a patchwork of state laws, and so a national law would make a lot of sense, so that everybody, and really should apply across the board to all kinds of businesses, because as we've all discussed, whether it's a hospital or a college or a utility or whatever, I mean, they all have sensitive personal information. But breach obviously isn't enough, because as the other panelists have pointed out, it's the time at which the value is given, whether it's the IRS giving your tax refund to somebody else, or some other transaction where either that government agency or a private sector company does not have the capability or the incentive to truly authenticate the individual to whom they're, with whom they're dealing. So authentication is a huge part of it, and we are seeing improvements and promise of a lot more improvements in the whole authentication area. Now, I will say that that comes with the challenge of helping customers understand why there is this process. There's always that balance of, do you have a short password, like password, and use the same password on every account, or, do the customers understand and accept why a company or a federal agency goes through another step of verifying that person's identity before they, distribute whatever it is, whether it's the benefit or the tax return or whatever. So there's that, customer bringing the public along with you and helping to understand the need for security and the, saying, oh, okay, it's a little inconvenient. It's going to take me 5 seconds more to get through this transaction, but that's okay. I get it.
I have to say, I think the financial institutions have really been the pioneer in that education to their consumers, because for a while when, you were starting the two-factor authentication, right, making it a little bit more difficult, there was a little bit of consumer pushback, but we don't hear that anymore. We don't hear, I can't believe my bank is making me have to go jump through these hoops. There's actually a level of appreciation for the protection. Now we just need to kind of have everybody else come along and educate consumers that yes, you're going to have to give up just a little bit of the convenience factor for security. And I understand the role that business has trying to balance those. You want to make your customers happy. I get that. But I think it can be done with messaging that you can make them happy by demonstrating that this is good for them and they want it.
So I think there's consensus. And of course, everything that I'm saying today is my opinion alone, doesn't necessarily represent the position of the FTC or any particular commissioner. And I usually remember to say that right before I say something like way off the reservation. But I think that there's, general consensus on data security, breach notice. I mean, we're there. So let's look a little bit on the authentication side. So when the FTC promulgated the red flags rule, an anti-fraud rule that requires creditors and financial institutions to have programs to detect red flags of fraud, identity fraud, the AMA came to us and they said, well, not a problem for us. We shouldn't be covered even if we are, creditors under the law because there's no such thing as medical identity theft. And we said, actually, there is such a thing as medical identity theft, and it resulted in a lawsuit and a long story, which I won't go into here. So then I went to a doctor a couple weeks ago, and there was a sign that said, we're going to ask for your driver's license if you're a new patient to make sure that we're dealing with the right person. We do this under the FTC's red flags rule, which is meant to prevent identity theft. And I thought, yeah, yes. So I, of course, made a point of saying, I'm so happy that you're doing this, and I'm happy to share with you my driver's license to make sure that no one else uses my insurance to blah, blah, blah. I'm always like crusading on whatever we're doing there. But I think there is a greater tolerance for these inconveniences if, number one, the consumers can see the benefit for themselves, and number two, on the other side, if the businesses, even if a doctor's office sees some kind of return on investment, and that either be they don't have to deal with cleaning up their records after an incident of medical identity theft. People feel that they trust them more, even if there may be a little more friction in the beginning part of the commercial relationship. So I think there, our thought process is going along, but I think part of it is because, as Ann said, people understand why they need to jump through these hoops. We're used to it in the Know Your Customer rule and in financial institutions, but if they're seen as layers of protection, maybe people would be more willing to kind of, take a deep breath, give the information under these circumstances because you understand why it's being asked for and why you're benefiting from it.
Good. So it's clear that identity theft is part of a larger problem, a larger data security problem. And, I think that there's consensus that addressing it is going to require sort of what I'll call a holistic approach by the federal government, industry, and individual consumers. Are we moving towards that approach, or is our response to the problem of identity theft still reliant on, I think someone mentioned silos, on siloed solutions to the problem?
Well, my experience, unfortunately, and I've had a great experience here today because I've talked to some people who've talked about the strong collaborations they have that have all three legs of that stool. My experience has been that we do have these silos, and I'm seeing industry groups that want to discuss the issue over here, and we've got regulatory and government over here, and then NGOs such as myself kind of trying to get wherever we can to discuss the issue. And I think everybody here and in the audience would say that we know that we need all three to get together, collaborate, and figure this out. And even if we get nonprofits and government over here and still have industry off to one side, the only person that loses in that is the consumers. And if that means that we have to make some uncomfortable compromises, then we need to be prepared for that on all three parties. I know that's unpopular, but I can represent the ITRC. That is our opinion. We need to really look at how to solve the problem and make a compromise. I won't say a sacrifice, but we need to get everybody in the room. I'm not seeing it as strongly as I should, and I'm hoping it gets better.
I would second everything Eva said, and I will tell a story too. And it's also about the medical industry. We were founded, ITech was founded on the idea of industry collaboration, and we started with the financial services industry, but the intention was always to go to other industries. So I'll never forget, went over to the American Hospital, it was a hospital trade association, And I tried to explain how, how our model worked and how, excuse me, we would help consumers who might be victims of identity theft, at the hospitals. And it was like a complete blank stare. I had no idea what I was talking about. And just no concept of, this initiative from financial services could be adapted to another industry. So it was, I was speaking Martian to them, and they just had no idea. And so I think we probably have made some progress, but we still are extremely siloed into each industry, thinking they have a unique relationship with their customers, or they don't have this kind of information, or they don't have a problem, or they just don't have the commitment to customer service. Whatever the barriers are, but there's a lot of resistance, I think, in industry that, this isn't their problem.
And so that kind of brings up the IRS issue with the tax refund, and this was maybe as more doors were locked on the way that you can commit identity theft, they kept trying the doors, and the one to the IRS opened up a little more easily than others. And so they were not necessarily keyed into it, but they are now. But I want to change the silos in a way, reconfigure them, because the other way of looking at this is instead of through the parties that are stakeholders, is through the life cycle of identity theft. And that has to do with prevention, through data security and best practices by consumers. It has to do with authentication and hardening up the authentication systems, better, stronger prosecutions and sharing of information to do prosecutions, better victim assistance, and easier to use remedies, and all of that. So those are the other elements that need to be looked at holistically by all of the parties, because I think the life cycle is the same regardless of the sector in which the identity theft occurs.
I agree.
Yeah. I think, one of the things we talked about in our white paper is that we need to, we were calling for a re-examination of this issue, sort of a President's Identity Theft Task Force version 2. And, do you feel, on the panel, do you feel that that's something that would be beneficial to convene? What I'm thinking is do we need a mechanism to sort of break through those silos and start thinking about addressing ID theft in this sort of life cycle way that you talked about, Betsy?
I'm going to look for my colleagues and see if they have an answer for that. Do one of you have an answer to whether you, in your own personal opinion, whether it's worthwhile having a way to re-examine the conclusions? Right where the gentleman behind you with the mic. I'm sorry if I'm kind of usurping your
We're going to go to
prerogative.
Q&A after this one, so
Okay.
I think there are enough new mechanisms that have come into place that have taken the place of the original recommendations and original task force that can address the current issues and trends.
Thank you, Lisa.
Well, I think we're going to go to Q&A now. We've got a roving mic going around, and if I've learned one thing, it's always to let my boss speak first, and she's holding the mic. So, Sally, go ahead.
Is this on? Yeah. Thank you for a wonderful panel. It's been really interesting to hear all your real-life perspectives. Eva, I have to say I'm intrigued by something you mentioned about biometrics and behavior identity theft. So it's got, me having the sort of worst kind of nightmares about who has my information and who might be watching. And, and this sort of bleeds into the issue of privacy in general. Mm-hmm. There's cameras everywhere. Mm-hmm. Every city's just, filled with surveillance cameras.
And there's cameras up
yeah,
here. Everybody's got one in their
that's
pocket.
true. Yeah. So there's that issue. There's also, we've learned of real porousness between private and government information transfer. We've learned that with the NSA information that's, gone, with metadata, billions of pieces of metadata. Mm-hmm. So I'd love you to, and I invite other panel members to join in. Tell us about what you see coming in those areas. I've been toying with, do you go to do the airport thing and have your, your fingerprints taken and your biometrics taken because you can get through the lines? And there's always that fear that that's going to end up in the wrong hands. So if you would, talk about that and what we might be able to do about it to protect consumers.
Well, we have been paying attention to a lot to privacy and security and authentication. And so I've been listening to the discussion about identity, and the biometrics industry will tell you, obviously, that that's the way to go. It's the safest way to really communicate that that's you. And look, on your iPhone now, you've got your fingerprint. And I will admit, my son has that iPhone, and in order for me to log on, my fingerprint is remembered in there as well. So there are decisions that we have to make about security versus convenience, and I think as long as we can make them in an educated way, we're certainly better off. And when you think about all of that data, it's getting so much cheaper to store all of that data now. 10 years ago, you would have talked about storing terabytes, and boy, only the government was doing that. And now you've got individual people doing life logging. Have you seen those folks that wear the camera and just log pictures of their whole life? They're storing terabytes of data, but it's actually affordable now. So, and I think we're going to keep going that way. There's nothing to stop us. And all of that data that is making it easier for industries to market to you, and that's actually convenient. It's also becoming part of what authenticates who you are. That's how your credit card companies are able to know, well, now I need to give them a fraud call. And I think we have to be very aware of that. I think we have to be looking, just knowing that that's part of your identity, and what can you do about it? I don't have a solution for that. There's not a lot you can do about it except get off the grid. You know, who's going to do that? But again, I think we have to be aware of that. I think we have to look at asking organizations if they're truly following their privacy policies and where that data is going. And just my last thought is, one of the things that we need to realize is, once my PII, my data, when I have it, once I give it to company A to provide me with a service, most consumers are still under the impression, well, that's my data, that's my information. Not anymore. That's the property of those companies. And they can share it and do whatever they want if you have given it to them. And that's especially true even with the credit reporting agencies. That data is mined and sold in, you get one inquiry on your credit, it goes out in 20 different ways after that for triggers and extracts and all of those things. And we need to definitely be paying attention, a lot more than we are now.
We can take another question. Anyone? I have one over here. Susan Grant.
Hi, Susan Grant, Consumer Federation of America. Recently, somebody in my office got a breach notice from a federal agency not represented on the panel, for whom she used to be a contractor, telling her that her information had been compromised, including her Social Security number. And it said, check your credit reports. That was the advice on the breach notice, which, as you know, isn't going to tell you if your Social Security number has been used for employment or a lot of other reasons that are not going to show up on your credit report. So my question is, should breach notices be more specific about what you should do depending on the kind of information that has been compromised? And the second part of that question is, if it is something like your Social Security number or something else that really is going to require some kind of ongoing monitoring and assistance, should there be a responsibility on the part of the breached entity to provide services through the ITRC or someone else to help those people navigate the problem and monitor it?
Do you want to?
I've been doing a lot of talking.
Good question, Susan. So I think we have model letters. Do we have model breach letters? We used to. Yeah. We have model breach letters at the FTC that companies can use that do say, if your Social Security number is breached, not only should you check your credit report, at that time, you should check it 3 months later and 3 months later after that, and blah, blah, blah. Plus, if these other types of vulnerabilities exist, these are the steps that you can take. So your question kind of leads to the answer, which is clearly that, again, speaking on my own behalf, was an inadequate breach notice because the consumer really didn't know what else to do. So I think that's fair to say. What was the second part of your questions?
Recovery.
Yeah, and I think a lot of companies now will routinely offer, or they used to, credit monitoring. Here's the problem. As you look at wholesale thefts of data, they'll sit on that, for the year or the 2 years when the consumer has the credit monitoring, and it doesn't lose any value. They just have to kind of sit on it for a while. So perhaps, I'm not saying that it's a problem getting credit monitoring or providing credit monitoring, but that shouldn't be seen as a way to prevent any harm. Consumers need to be mindful that they always now need to be alert to their greater exposure and vulnerability to identity theft. But I don't really have any opinion on whether providing those services should be a mandatory element of any legislative solution.
Yeah, and I would say, going back to what I talked about earlier, I think there should be a much better understanding across all industries, and indeed the government, on the plight of the consumer who faces the consequences of a misused identity, and how to recover, how to put that right. Those kinds of remedies exist only in certain very limited silos, very sectors, but there is not a general understanding of when things go wrong, there ought to be a way, a relatively easy and not very costly way for the consumer, again, whether it's a government agency or a private sector, to make that, to have a path for the consumer to follow and to rectify that problem.
And if I can add to that, and building on the point that Eva made with recovering from medical identity theft, this was exactly the problem that people had with financial identity theft. They'd find that someone had opened up an account in their name, and they needed a copy of the application so that they can establish that they were victims of identity theft. So they'd call up whoever issued the credit, and they said, this is what happened to me, and I need a copy of the application to show that that was not my signature. And the company would say, well, it's your name, but you're telling me it's not your account. So right to financial privacy, I can't give you this application. Like, really? First of all, you're making me financially responsible for this bill, yet you're not giving me copies. And so it was this catch-22. So in, I think it was the FACT Act amendments, consumers were given the ability to get a copy of the application material if they had a police report or an identity theft affidavit that supported their good faith request to have that, and it kept, the banks off any problem of liability. So now the same problem arises with respect to HIPAA and, purported obligations under HIPAA and the failure to give someone the records. And this seems like a real gap, as you say. It's not a remedy that goes across all sectors.
And I'm going to have to call time here. I think this is a conversation that we could have for another hour or two even. And in fact, there is an opportunity for you to participate in a continuing conversation on this issue next week. NCL runs a coalition called the Alliance Against Fraud, which is a group that comes together quarterly to discuss issues emerging in the fraud space. And next Wednesday here in Washington, we are going to have our fourth quarterly meeting. We'll be talking about the themes of identity theft that were raised in this conference. So if you're interested in coming to that, please do see me after we're done. And so with that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap. I'd like to thank, once again, our panel here. It's been a wonderful discussion. And I'd like to thank all of you again for coming to this event today. Thank you to our underwriters at Google once again. And thank you again. We'll see you another time. Bye-bye.